Like you, I was several times moved to tears, sometimes by specific things that were said, sometimes just by the sense of the day and what this means to us. We're just so glad that you were here and willing to spend the time with us. Thanks for coming out. Our news lately has, of course, been politics and celebrities and sporting events. But tonight we're interested in the news of the soul. And the founding of this institute is our attempt to celebrate the possibilities of bigger lives, more articulate lives, more meaningful lives. You all recall that passage in Scripture, yes, when Jesus says, standing in front of the multitudes, "I have come that you might have life." And then there's that look that goes across his face. More to say. That pause. No, not just life, but, remember? Life in all its abundance, fullness, big life, capital letter life. Standing in the book signing line a few times today, something I've done many, many times, standing over people's shoulders and listening as people come forward. It doesn't take very long to figure out that it's not about the signature. It's about the attempt to say, 10 years ago when I was troubled, bewildered, ill, when this happened, when that happened, you saved my life. It's about the attempt to say thanks. And so it's a great privilege to have these two on our stage tonight. Two men who between them have written somewhere around 90 books. I'm a little hesitant about the number because there have been a few days passed since I looked that number up. They represent something like 100 years of thinking about writing, about faith, about art, about thinking. They've invested lifetimes in us, helping us see from new angles, mentoring us in mystery and possibility. In his Lyman Beecher lectures at Yale in 1985, finally comes the poet. Brueggemann speaks of preachers as poets in a prose-flattened world. And in 76, at the Beecher lectures, Buechner speaks of the preacher's stewardship over the wildest tale of them all. These two have, in so many ways, over the years, tried to help us toward the stunning notion that Scripture shimmers with implication, that our lives are full of meaning. So we're really blessed to have them here tonight, to have all of you here tonight. Why don't you welcome them and let them get settled. That's Walter. That's Fred.
Since our initial point of contact, you and me, was at Union Seminary with James Meilenberg, let's start by you talking about your interaction with him and the way in which he influenced your life and your work.
Dr. Meilenberg, his picture is on my desk, and he had a very striking face, and his most striking feature, I think, was his eyes, sort of burning eyes. When he looked at you, he was looking right into you, and he's looking into me every day that I sit there, and I keep thinking it's a kind of a challenging look, as if, come on, do what you can, and it's also a rather comforting look. He's on your side, and I always felt that about him. Judy and I asked him to marry us in 1956, and he graciously said he would. He wasn't a marrying minister. I think he'd had a church in the Middle West for a time, but that wasn't his bag. He was a teacher, great, great teacher. And this great big wedding was not at all what he was used to, and he was nervous as a cat. And I remember as he stood there with a prayer book in his hands trembled so that it made Judy and me feel calm by comparison. So I remember that about him. And also I remember an early novel of mine, not worth anybody's time to read, called The Return of Ansel Gibbs. I used him as a awful phrase, awful word used, but I did. I put him into the book as a character. And when it was all done, and already in proof, I think, so it was sort of a hollow gesture, I showed it to him, thinking if he thought it was too awful, what could they do? They couldn't undo the proofs. And he was, I tried to present him as totally as I could with all his dynamism and his extraordinary gifts as a teacher and a speaker and a communicator. And the first thing he said was, "Oh my God," he said, "what's Albright going to think?"
Yes.
He thought he came through as a sort of show-off. Well, of course, he didn't at all. But our friendship survived that, and we kept on. He left Union and went off to teach in a seminary in California, and we continued to correspond. And I remember one letter he said, "I've become senile. He's no more senile than I am." I wish I could find a better way of saying that. But he worried about it, and I think the end of his life was a sad end. I always had that impression.
Yeah.
The fire had sort of died down, but anyway, he was a great man. And specifically, what did he do for my life? I don't know, besides just illumining great passages of it by his presence. He was a very honest man. I can't imagine his pretending to believe anything he didn't believe. Unlike a great many ministers I've heard who I feel are saying what they think is good for the congregation to know, to hear, and to believe, but they themselves don't share it. He would never have done that. He would never have done that. He was a tattered flag. He was a wounded man, partly because he was so honest about his own faith.
He had a hard time in Old Testament studies because he was bucking the whole Albright business with rhetoric and literature
Yes,
and all of that.
I'm sure he was worried about it. And then also, of course, people kept tossing her into his teeth, or he at himself. He'd written very little. But who cares? He had taught these spectacular classes where he would hold not a room as big as this, but a room almost as big as this, full of people absolutely spellbound, coming in hundreds with their friends and their friends' friends to hear this remarkable man evoke the world of the Old Testament. And when he became Adam, naming the animals, he was Adam. That, I'm going to call that an elephant. That's a giraffe. That's a guinea pig. And Eve shivering in the realization of her betrayal. And anyway, he was, enough of that, but he was a marvelous man. My life would have been vastly impoverished had I not known him. I miss him. I think about him a lot.
You've written mainly about Meilenberg. Were there other teachers at Union that made a difference to you?
Nobody in anything like that. Since John Knox, these are all names unfamiliar to all except really the oldest among you, but John Knox was just the reverse. He was a New Testament scholar and a meticulous scholar. I mean, every inch of the New Testament he would raise up and explicate for us, which made him not a spellbinder like Meilenberg, but again, there was something about him that was so authentic and so deeply interested in conveying it to us that he also, in his quiet way, meant a good deal to me. And I can't think if anybody else comes to mind, but and Tillich. I was there from 54 to 58, and all the great luminaries, all the great theological luminaries of the Western world, really, they were there. And if they weren't teaching there, they would come through, like Martin Buber, like Rudolf Bultmann. They all took their turn, and it was just wildly exciting. Tillich, this marvelous man with a sort of musical comedy German accent. If anyone has a question, please raise your finger, he would say. And his famous remark that was echoed all through the seminary for years: "You cannot have such a thing as face without gnosis." And Niebuhr, who had had a stroke by then, and he'd left him with one sort of crippled hand he held like that, and his voice was slurred, almost like a drunk's voice, but it didn't dampen the flame. He was still, if Tillich was depth of knowledge, Niebuhr was breadth of knowledge. He knew what was going on in Japan at the time that Magna Carta was being signed in Runnymede. He was just an unbelievable man. So I was it was my first real education at college. I thought of college as a sort of smorgasbord. I'd take a little bit of this, a little bit of that. I didn't work very hard at any of it. Here I was so motivated to find out more about this faith of which I knew almost nothing, having been brought up outside of it entirely. And so hungry to learn that I learned more than I ever learned anywhere else. And I'm vastly grateful to it. And I have no idea what it's like now. I went there once to give a talk about something, and it seemed to me it was a haunted house. I was so aware of the ghosts. There may be wonderful people there, but I don't know who they are. Yeah. Are there wonderful people there?
They're wonderful people, but since our teachers left, the glory has departed.
The glory, right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
You shared with us this wonderful piece today about the last drive.
Oh, yes.
So I want to ask you about your early family nurture, and what about all that contributed to you becoming a writer?
Well, the main contribution, it gave me something to write about. I mean, all my life I've been drawing on those early days, either directly or indirectly. Yeah. I had a difficult childhood. I had a very privileged childhood in many ways, but it was during the Depression. My father was drinking too much. The marriage became a desperately unhappy one. My mother, for all her many strengths, was vicious in her attacks on him in front of her children as worthless and weak and all that. And I absorbed all that, obviously, even at the age of whatever I was, 8 or 10. And I still carry the burden of it with me. I mean, my father died in 1936 when I was 10, so that I really have no memory of him, or even any memory of remembering him. I thought about that the other day. I don't remember remembering him. And that is a very long and dark shadow. I don't think a day goes by without my thinking about him, in as much as one can think about somebody whom one never really knew. But I think there's no question that a lot of what I've written about has been in one way or another a sort of search for a father. I think Leo Bebb may be sort of a father figure for me, of all people, and Godric had somewhat the same experience. His father was a sort of non-father. He worked so hard, as my father did, that he wasn't around very much. And as Godric says, he starved us for the one thing which we needed most, which was him. Mm. You know, he worked and grubbed and tilled his little half-acre of turnips and onions and things, but he wasn't there. So I think it's been, the effect of those early days was mainly to give me the territory I've been working ever since. Here I am at the age of 82, talking to you about these things that happened so many long years ago, but there you are.
You said in your piece today about your mother that she was so wonderful and could be a monster. I think you used that word. It occurred to me that this is a parallel formulation to Luther, simul justus et peccator. We are at the same time saint and sinner.
Yes.
So it occurred to me when you said that about your mother that this is kind of the whole human drama in Nietzsche, that all of the ambiguities that have shown up in your struggle for truth, you already discerned that early on right there.
I never would have thought to put it that way, but I suppose there's some truth in that, yeah. I've said to several people today, if my mother had turned up in some spectral uniform